My uncle tried to steal my inheritance, so I exposed his affair at the family reunion. When my grandmother died last year, she left me her house, the only person who'd ever believed in me. Uncle Richard was furious. He'd expected everything since he was the oldest son, the successful businessman, the golden child who could do no wrong in everyone's eyes. But Grandma had seen right through his fake charm and carefully constructed facade that had fooled everyone else for decades. That house should go to family, he said at the funeral, his voice dripping with indignation and barely contained rage, like I wasn't standing right there in my ill-fitting black dress that I'd bought at Goodwill because I couldn't afford anything else on my graphic designer's salary. I was 25, barely scraping by as a freelance graphic designer in a city where everyone wanted premium work for bargain prices and expected miracles on impossible deadlines. Grandma's house wasn't a mansion by any stretch of the imagination, but it was completely paid off and filled with 40 years of memories that meant everything to me. She'd raised me there after my parents died in a horrific car crash when I was 12 years old. Richard had been too busy building his real estate empire and cultivating his reputation as the town's most successful businessman to take in a grieving, traumatized kid who reminded everyone of the family tragedy that had shattered our world. She needs stability, he told the social worker back then, gesturing vaguely in my direction while never quite looking directly at me, as if my grief was somehow contagious. I'm just not equipped to handle a child with such complex emotional needs. My business requires constant attention, and frankly, I don't have the time or resources to provide the kind of specialized care she's going to need. What he'd really meant was that a grieving orphan didn't fit his perfect family image. Richard had spent his entire adult life crafting an image of success and respectability, and a traumatized 12-year-old would have complicated that narrative. So Grandma, despite being 73 years old and dealing with her own overwhelming grief over losing her eldest son, had stepped up without a moment's hesitation. That girl belongs with family who actually loves her, she'd said firmly, her voice brooking no argument. And that was the end of the discussion as far as she was concerned. For 13 years, she'd been my anchor, my champion, my safe harbor in a world that felt unpredictable and dangerous. She'd attended every school play, even the terrible ones where I forgot my lines. She'd helped with homework until midnight when I was struggling with advanced algebra. She'd taught me how to drive in her ancient Buick, patiently enduring my jerky stops and missed turns. She'd listened to my teenage problems with infinite patience, offering wisdom wrapped in warm cookies and unconditional love. When I'd struggled to find my place in the world after high school, feeling lost and directionless while my classmates seemed to have their lives figured out, she'd been the one to suggest graphic design. She'd recognized my artistic talents when everyone else saw only my struggles with traditional academics, and she'd even helped pay for my portfolio development when I couldn't afford the software and equipment I needed. You see the world differently, she'd told me while we sat in her kitchen, looking through my sketches. That's not a weakness, sweetheart. That's your superpower. Now she was gone, and Richard saw an opportunity to finally get what he'd always believed he deserved. For months after the funeral, he tried everything in his considerable arsenal to steal my inheritance. First came the Concerned Family Member Act, complete with furrowed brows and carefully modulated voice tones designed to convey reluctant worry. Property ownership is incredibly complex, he'd explained to anyone who'd listen, his tone patronizing and false, like he was discussing a child's inability to handle advanced mathematics. She's young, inexperienced, emotionally fragile from her recent loss. She doesn't understand the financial implications or the legal responsibilities that come with real estate ownership. When that approach didn't gain the traction he'd hoped for, he escalated to more serious accusations. He began claiming that Grandma wasn't mentally competent when she wrote her final will, suggesting that age-related cognitive decline had impaired her judgment and made her vulnerable to manipulation. My client believes his mother was suffering from early-stage dementia during the period when this will was executed, Richard's lawyer had argued during one particularly brutal legal session. The defendant took calculated advantage of this diminished mental capacity to unduly influence her testamentary decisions, isolating her from other family members and poisoning her mind against my client. It was complete and utter bullshit, and we all knew it. Grandma had been sharp as a tack until the day she died from a sudden heart attack. She'd managed her own finances with meticulous attention to detail, drove herself to all her appointments, maintained an active social calendar, and could beat anyone in the family at Scrabble or crossword puzzles. Her mind had been completely intact, which was exactly why she'd seen through Richard's facade when no one else had. But Richard had money and connections, while I was drowning in legal fees I couldn't afford and fighting a battle I'd never expected to face. The depositions were pure torture, sitting in sterile conference rooms with fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable chairs while Richard's legal team systematically picked apart every interaction I'd had with Grandma over the past 13 years. They twisted innocent moments of love and care into evidence of calculated manipulation. They questioned why I'd visited so often, as if loving your grandmother was somehow suspicious. They demanded explanations for why she'd helped pay for my art supplies, why she'd driven me to job interviews, why she'd chosen me over her own son in her will. "Isn't it true that you deliberately isolated Mrs. Harrison from other family members?" they'd ask, their voices laden with false concern and barely disguised accusation. "No," I'd answer for the 100th time, my voice growing hoarse from hours of repetitive questioning. "I visited because I loved her, and she loved me. And isn't it remarkably convenient that these visits increased in frequency as she aged and became more vulnerable? The implication was clear and absolutely disgusting. They were painting me as a predator who'd systematically targeted my own grandmother, grooming her for financial exploitation like some kind of elder abuse scheme. The lawyers would exchange meaningful glances when they thought I wasn't looking, as if they'd uncovered some smoking gun that proved their theory. Richard sat across from me during these sessions, his face a carefully constructed mask of fake concern and righteous indignation. He'd perfected the role of the grieving son, fighting valiantly to protect his mother's legacy from a manipulative granddaughter who'd taken advantage of her generosity. To anyone who didn't know the real Richard, he looked like the victim in this situation, a successful businessman reluctantly forced to take legal action against a family member he'd rather protect. But I knew better. I remembered how he'd actually treated Grandma when he thought no one was watching or paying attention, the impatient sighs when she told stories he'd heard before, stories that were precious to her but boring to him, the way he'd check his phone constantly during family dinners, scrolling through emails and text messages while she tried to engage him in conversation, how he'd only visit when he needed something, money for risky business ventures, her signature on documents he'd never fully explain, or her public endorsement for some community position he was seeking. "Mother, I really need you to sign this," he'd say, sliding papers across her kitchen table without bothering to explain what they were. "It's just a formality, but it would help me out tremendously." Grandma would read every word carefully, asking questions he'd answer with obvious irritation, as if her caution was somehow insulting to his integrity. The breaking point in my relationship with Richard came when I discovered he'd been actively sabotaging my life outside the courtroom. My client load had been mysteriously drying up over the past several months, with longtime customers suddenly canceling projects without clear explanations. At first, I'd attributed it to the economic downturn affecting small businesses, or maybe just normal fluctuations in freelance work. Then Mrs. Chen from the bakery pulled me aside after I'd finished designing their new summer menu, her expression nervous and apologetic. "I probably shouldn't tell you this," she whispered, glancing around her empty shop like she was worried about being overheard. "But someone's been calling our regular customers, warning them about working with you." My blood ran cold as the implications hit me. "What kind of warnings?" "They're saying you're unreliable, that you're going through serious legal troubles and might not finish projects or deliver on time. Some man claiming to be looking out for the community's best interests, protecting local businesses from making poor decisions." The systematic nature of it was breathtaking. Richard wasn't just fighting me in court, he was attempting to destroy my livelihood, ensuring that I couldn't afford to keep fighting him even if I wanted to. That afternoon, I drove to my dad's house to drop off some of Grandma's photo albums I'd been organizing and digitizing. Dad had been trying to stay neutral in the inheritance fight, attempting to maintain peace between his brother and his daughter, while clearly struggling with the impossible position he'd been placed in. But I could see the strain wearing on him, the way this family conflict was tearing at relationships that had been stable for decades. I was in the kitchen organizing photos when I heard Richard's voice carrying from the living room. He was there for one of their weekly coffee meetings, supposedly to discuss family matters, but really to lobby Dad for support in his legal campaign against me. "If she can't afford the property taxes, she'll have to sell," Richard was saying, his voice carrying the unmistakable satisfaction of someone whose carefully orchestrated plan was working exactly as intended. "I've been making some strategic calls around town. Her little design business is struggling more than she's letting on." "Richard, that's enough," Dad said, his voice tired but still firm. "Mom left her the house for a reason. She knew what she was doing. Mom was manipulated by a master manipulator." Richard shot back, his mask of reasonableness slipping slightly. "That girl has been playing the poor orphan card for years, making Mom feel guilty about the accident, about not being able to save her son. She isolated Mom from the rest of us, then swooped in like a vulture when Mom was at her most vulnerable." I pressed myself against the kitchen wall, my hands shaking with rage as I listened to him systematically destroy my character and rewrite the history of my relationship with the woman who'd saved my life. "She's 25 years old and barely functional," he continued, his voice taking on the cruel edge I remembered from childhood, when he'd make cutting remarks about my academic struggles or social awkwardness. "She can't handle property ownership or the responsibilities that come with it. She'll run it into the ground, and then what? Mom's legacy becomes some rundown rental property, because we let sentiment cloud our judgment about what's best for the family." "She's family too," Dad said quietly, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "She's a burden," Richard snapped, dropping all pretense of familial concern. "She always has been, ever since the accident. Mom felt sorry for her, guilty about the circumstances, but that doesn't mean we have to keep enabling her dysfunction and poor decision-making for the rest of our lives." That's when I realized this wasn't really about money or property or even inheritance rights. This was about power, control, and Richard's fundamental belief that I didn't deserve the love and recognition Grandma had given me. In his mind, I was still that traumatized 12-year-old who'd inconveniently survived when his golden boy brother hadn't. A living reminder of family tragedy that he'd never wanted to deal with. More importantly, I was evidence that Grandma had seen through his carefully constructed facade and chosen someone else as her heir. That was the real insult he couldn't forgive. Not the money, but the public rejection of everything he'd spent his life building. I decided that enough was enough. Richard thought he was completely untouchable, and from his perspective, why wouldn't he? For 30 years, he'd cultivated an image of success and respectability that had everyone in town fooled. Married to sweet, devoted Aunt Carol, pillar of the community, deacon at St. Mary's Episcopal Church, where he gave inspirational readings about moral values and family commitment. He owned the biggest real estate company in 3 counties and had his professionally photographed face on half the bus stop benches in town with the slogan, Harrison Properties, building dreams, building community. Everyone respected him, trusted him implicitly, believed his version of events without question. When he said I was an unstable young woman trying to steal from my own family, people nodded sympathetically and offered their support for his difficult but necessary legal battle. But I'd been watching Richard my entire life, and I'd noticed things that others missed or chose to ignore. The way he'd disappear during family gatherings, claiming urgent phone calls that couldn't wait, but somehow always lasted exactly long enough for him to miss cleanup duties. How he always volunteered to run errands alone, picking up groceries, getting gas, stopping by the office to check on something, and would invariably take twice as long as the task actually required. The subtle way he'd change cologne before family events, as if covering scents that shouldn't be there. The perfume smell that definitely wasn't Carol's expensive floral fragrance when he'd give goodbye hugs. Most telling were his phone habits. Richard was constantly on his phone during family gatherings, but there was a distinct difference between his business calls and his other conversations. During business calls, he was loud and confident, wanting everyone to hear how important and successful he was, how many deals he was closing, how much money he was making. But there were other calls where he'd step outside or lower his voice, speaking in intimate tones that made my skin crawl when I thought about Carol sitting inside, probably assuming he was handling some urgent business matter. So I started following him, initially just out of curiosity and maybe hoping to catch him in some minor hypocrisy I could use as leverage in our inheritance battle. I never expected to uncover the scope of his deception or the devastating betrayal he was perpetrating on the family that worshipped him. The first time I followed him was on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, about 6 months after Grandma's funeral. He'd left a family dinner early, claiming an important client meeting that couldn't be rescheduled. Carol had been disappointed because she'd made his favorite dessert, but she'd packed it up for him to take home later, telling him she understood how demanding his work could be. But instead of going to his office downtown, Richard drove directly to the Sunset Motel on Highway 9, a seedy place known for hourly rates and people who didn't want to be seen together. I'd driven past it countless times, but never really paid attention to what kind of business it conducted. I parked across the street behind an abandoned gas station, using my camera's telephoto lens to watch as Richard sat in his silver Mercedes for about 10 minutes, repeatedly checking his phone and looking around nervously like a teenager about to do something forbidden. Then a red Honda Civic pulled up next to him, and out stepped Linda Martinez, his secretary of 8 years. Linda was 32, recently divorced with 2 young kids and a mountain of student debt from her paralegal degree. She'd always been professional at company events and family gatherings, quiet and efficient, the kind of employee who blended into the background while keeping everything running smoothly. I'd never given her much thought beyond noting that she seemed competent and dedicated to her job. But watching her embrace my uncle in that motel parking lot, I saw her completely differently. They kissed with the desperate passion of people who'd been waiting all day for this moment, their bodies pressed together like they were trying to merge into one person. Richard's hands were all over her, groping and pawing with an urgency that was both pathetic and disgusting to witness. It wasn't the gentle affection of a long-married couple, or even the playful flirtation of new lovers. It was raw, desperate lust combined with the thrill of forbidden behavior. I took photos with my camera's telephoto lens, my stomach churning as I documented their betrayal frame by frame. The images were crystal clear, leaving no room for doubt or alternative interpretation. Richard Harrison, pillar of the community and devoted husband, passionately kissing his secretary in a motel parking lot, while his wife was probably at home preparing his dinner. They disappeared into room 237 and didn't emerge for 3 hours and 27 minutes. I timed it. Over the following weeks, I established their pattern with the methodical precision of a detective building a case. Every Tuesday and Thursday, same time, same motel. Richard would tell Carol he had client meetings or property inspections that would keep him busy all afternoon. Linda would take extended lunch breaks, claiming personal errands or doctor's appointments. They had their deception choreographed down to the minute, a well-rehearsed dance of lies that had clearly been perfected over months or possibly years. But I wanted more than just evidence of an affair. Plenty of marriages survived infidelity, and exposing Richard's cheating wouldn't necessarily stop his legal assault on my inheritance. I needed ammunition that would destroy his credibility completely, something so damaging that no one would ever believe his version of events again. That's when I started gathering their digital trail. Richard had always been careless with technology, treating computers and phones like appliances rather than potential evidence repositories. He'd use the family computer at Grandma's house to check his email during family gatherings, never bothering to log out properly or clear his browsing history. During family dinners, he'd leave his phone lying around while he played the devoted family man, apparently confident that no one would ever think to look through his private messages. More crucially, he'd given Linda access to his business email accounts so she could handle client communications and transaction paperwork. What he hadn't considered was that she might keep comprehensive records of everything they discussed, including their personal relationship and their plans for the future. The text messages were an absolute goldmine of incriminating evidence. Hundreds of them, spanning 3 years, documenting every aspect of their affair in explicit detail. Not just the obvious romantic and sexual communication, but intimate details about their relationship, their feelings about their respective spouses, and their elaborate plans for the future they were secretly building together. Richard had been living a complete double life with the skill of a professional con artist, compartmentalizing his existence so thoroughly that even people who knew him well had no idea what he was really like when he thought no one was watching. "Can't wait to get away from this suffocating prison," he'd written to Linda one evening while sitting at Carol's dinner table, probably while she was describing her day or asking about his work. "2 more hours of pretending to care about her sister's latest divorce drama, then I can focus on what actually matters." "Poor baby," Linda had responded. "Tomorrow we can forget all about her and just be ourselves." The messages revealed the depth of his deception and his utter contempt for the woman who'd devoted 30 years of her life to supporting his career and building his reputation in the community. He called Carol boring, frigid, clingy, and pathetic. He complained about having to have sex with her to maintain appearances, describing their intimate moments in terms so crude and dismissive that I felt physically sick reading them. He mocked her weight gain after menopause, her interests in gardening and book clubs, her close relationships with her sisters, sharing private details about their marriage that should never have been discussed with anyone, let alone his mistress. "She actually thinks I care about her stupid flower beds," he'd written. "Spent 20 minutes today listening to her babble about soil pH while I planned what I want to do to you tomorrow afternoon. Does she suspect anything?" Linda had asked. "Carol? Are you kidding? She's so desperate to believe in our perfect marriage that she'd rationalize away a signed confession. She sees what she wants to see." But the most damaging messages were about their future plans. Richard wasn't just having an affair, he was meticulously planning his escape from his current life, and my inheritance was the key to financing their new beginning. "Once I get this house situation resolved and the money is liquidated, we can start fresh somewhere nobody knows us," he'd written in a message that made my hands shake with rage. "That inheritance will give us everything we need for the down payment on the Florida house, plus enough left over to get the business established without having to rely on local connections. I can't wait to be free of this exhausting charade," he'd said in another message. "Carol can keep the local business and the community reputation. We'll have the real assets and the freedom to build something authentic together." Linda had been a fully willing participant in this planning, not some innocent victim seduced by a powerful older man. She'd already given notice at her current job effective 6 months in the future, enrolled her kids in a school district near Tampa, and researched properties in their target area. They had the entire scheme mapped out in meticulous detail, down to the fake family emergency that would justify Richard's sudden departure from town. "I told my ex-husband I'm considering relocating for a better job opportunity," she'd written. "He's actually supportive since it means he won't have to pay as much child support if the kids are in a cheaper area." Reading those messages, I realized that Richard wasn't just trying to steal my inheritance out of greed, spite, or even a sense of entitlement. He was systematically dismantling my legal claim to fund a completely new life with his mistress, using my grandmother's house as the foundation for their future together. Every legal maneuver, every character assassination, every attempt to discredit me and isolate me from family support. It was all in service of financing his affair and his escape from the responsibilities he'd accumulated over 30 years of marriage. The betrayal was breathtaking in its scope and calculation. I printed everything methodically, creating multiple copies and organizing them chronologically to tell the complete story of their relationship. Screenshots of the most damaging text conversations, bank records showing the motel charges and expensive gifts, receipts for weekend trips to luxury resorts that Richard had funded while claiming to be at business conferences. I even found evidence that he'd been skimming money from his business accounts to pay for their relationship, using client deposits and company funds to buy Linda jewelry, pay for romantic getaways, and cover the costs of their elaborate deception. But I needed the perfect moment to reveal it all. Random exposure wouldn't have the same devastating impact as a strategic reveal that would maximize the damage to Richard's reputation, while ensuring that everyone saw his true character simultaneously, in a context where he couldn't control the narrative or spin the story in his favor. The annual family reunion was absolutely perfect for this purpose. Our family took reunions seriously, treating them as sacred annual gatherings that strengthened bonds and maintained connections across 3 generations. Everyone attended unless they were literally dying or deployed overseas. This year's reunion was being held at Uncle Tom's Lake House, a sprawling property that could accommodate 60 people for a weekend of food, games, swimming, and the traditional Saturday night slideshow where someone would present family photos while Richard gave his annual speech about family values and commitment. Richard's speeches had become legendary within our family circle. He'd stand up with his wine glass after dinner, his voice taking on the polished cadence of a politician or preacher, and deliver stirring remarks about loyalty, sacrifice, and the importance of family bonds that transcended individual desires or temporary difficulties. He'd talk about the sacrifices previous generations had made to build the foundation we all enjoyed, the importance of supporting each other through difficult times, and the sacred nature of marriage and family commitments that should never be taken lightly. "We live in a world that's constantly trying to tear families apart," he'd said during last year's speech, his arm draped protectively around Carol's shoulders while she gazed up at him with obvious adoration. "We're bombarded with messages that individual happiness matters more than collective responsibility, that commitment is optional when it becomes difficult. But we stay strong because we understand that family is everything. We protect each other, we support each other, and we never give up on the people we love, even when they make mistakes or face challenges." The room would always erupt in enthusiastic applause. People would wipe away tears and hug each other, inspired by Richard's words and his example of family leadership. Several younger cousins had asked him to officiate their weddings because he was seen as the moral center of our extended family, the person who best embodied the values they wanted to celebrate. This year I was going to give them a very different kind of inspiration. I spent weeks preparing a slideshow titled Family Memories Through the Years and volunteered to handle all the technical setup, offering to bring my professional equipment and ensure everything ran smoothly. Everyone thought it was incredibly sweet that I wanted to honor Grandma's memory with a digital tribute, especially given how devastated I'd been by her death and how difficult the inheritance battle had been for everyone involved. "That's so thoughtful of you, sweetheart," Aunt Carol said when I called to offer my services, her voice warm with genuine affection. "Richard always says you're such a creative, caring girl despite everything you've been through. I know your grandmother would be so proud to see you channeling your grief into something positive for the family." I bet he did say exactly that, probably right before he texted Linda about what a pathetic burden I was. I loaded the presentation with genuine family photos from the past year, vacation pictures, birthday parties, holiday celebrations, graduations, and other milestone moments. Normal, heartwarming family memories that would put everyone in a sentimental, trusting mood, lowering their defenses and making them receptive to the emotional manipulation I was about to deploy. But I also embedded some very special slides toward the end, professional quality images I'd taken during my months of surveillance, strategically placed to create maximum dramatic impact. The photos were absolutely devastating in their clarity and timing. Crystal clear shots of Richard and Linda kissing passionately in the motel parking lot, their bodies pressed together in unmistakably intimate embraces. Images of them entering room 237 together, laughing and touching each other with obvious familiarity and comfort. Pictures of them emerging hours later with disheveled clothes and satisfied expressions, looking around carefully before separating and getting into their respective cars. I'd even captured them at a romantic restaurant 2 towns over, holding hands across a candlelit table while Richard was supposedly attending a business conference in the state capital. The timestamps on these photos would prove he'd been lying to Carol about his whereabouts, turning what should have been a business trip into a romantic getaway with his mistress. But the real ammunition was in the text message screenshots I'd carefully selected and enlarged for maximum readability. I'd chosen the most damaging exchanges, the ones that would reveal not just the affair, but Richard's complete contempt for his family and his calculated plans to steal from me. The night of the reunion, 60 family members gathered in Uncle Tom's spacious main room, a comfortable space with exposed beams, a massive stone fireplace, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. Kids ran around playing elaborate games of hide-and-seek, while adults caught up over wine and Carol's famous appetizers. The atmosphere was warm and celebratory, everyone relaxed and happy to be together after a year of busy schedules and scattered lives. Richard held court near the stone fireplace, regaling a captive audience with stories about his latest real estate deals and accepting congratulations for his difficult but necessary legal fight over Grandma's will. Several family members had openly expressed their support for his position, genuinely believing his narrative about protecting family assets from a young woman who couldn't handle such significant responsibility. "It's not personal, honey," Aunt Susan had told me earlier while we were setting up the buffet table. "Richard just wants what's best for everyone in the long run. Sometimes love means making hard decisions." "Exactly," my cousin Dave had added, reaching for another beer. "Sometimes you have to protect family from making mistakes they'll regret later. Richard's just looking out for your best interests, even though it's painful for him." They actually thought he was being noble and self-sacrificing, putting the family's welfare above his personal relationship with me. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so infuriating to watch them buy into his carefully constructed victim narrative. Carol spent the entire evening floating between the kitchen and the living room, making sure everyone had enough food and drink, checking on the kids, and ensuring that every detail was perfect. She'd clearly spent days preparing for this gathering, and her face absolutely glowed with happiness as she watched her extended family enjoy themselves in her carefully orchestrated celebration. She kept touching Richard's arm affectionately, bringing him his favorite snacks without being asked, and beaming with obvious pride when people complimented his recent business successes or praised his dedication to family values. Watching her innocent joy while knowing what I was about to reveal made my stomach churn with guilt and anticipation. Carol didn't deserve this public humiliation, this devastating betrayal exposed in front of 60 people who loved and respected her. But she also didn't deserve to waste another day of her life with a man who viewed her as an obstacle to his happiness, who mocked her behind her back and planned to abandon her as soon as he could access enough money to finance his escape. After dinner, Uncle Tom called for everyone's attention, his voice cutting through the comfortable murmur of satisfied conversation. Time for the traditional slideshow and Richard's annual speech about family values and commitment. I connected my laptop to the projector with trembling hands, my heart pounding so hard I was convinced everyone in the room could hear it echoing off the wooden walls. This was it. No going back, no second chances to reconsider or find a different approach. I started the presentation with innocent childhood photos of our parents' generation, black and white images from the 1960s and 70s showing young versions of people who were now grandparents. People smiled and pointed, sharing memories and laughing at old hairstyles, outdated fashion choices, and the awkward poses that characterized family photography from earlier decades. "Look at your dad with that ridiculous mustache," someone called out, pointing at a photo of my grandfather looking impossibly young in his military uniform. "He thought he was Tom Selleck." "Mom's perm was bigger than her entire head," another voice added, followed by gentle laughter and affectionate teasing. The photos progressed chronologically through the decades, showing high school graduations, college degrees, early marriages, the arrival of babies who were now adults with children of their own. Richard appeared frequently in the older photos, Usually looking serious and important even as a teenager, the kind of person who was voted most likely to succeed and actually lived up to the prediction. People commented on how he'd always been mature for his age, a natural leader who other kids looked up to for guidance and direction. The narrative being constructed through these images was exactly what Richard had cultivated his entire life: the responsible older brother, the successful businessman, the family patriarch who could be trusted with important decisions. The atmosphere in the room was relaxed and nostalgic. Everyone wine-buzzed and sentimental, sharing stories and reconnecting with relatives they only saw once a year. Perfect conditions for maximum emotional impact. I reached the end of the legitimate family photos and paused dramatically, letting the room settle into expectant quiet, while Richard prepared to deliver his traditional speech. He stood up slowly from his chair near the fireplace, wineglass in hand, his face already arranged in the expression of thoughtful solemnity that preceded his annual remarks. He'd clearly been preparing these comments for weeks, probably planning to tie them to Grandma's memory, and the importance of honoring her wishes. Meaning his interpretation of her wishes, of course. "Before Uncle Richard speaks," I announced, my voice cutting through the comfortable murmur of conversation like a knife through silk, "I'd like to share some very special recent family memories that I think really capture who we are as a family." I clicked to the next slide. The room fell into absolute deathly silence. There was Richard, captured in perfect high-definition clarity, pressed against Linda Martinez in the Sunset Motel parking lot. His hands were tangled in her hair, her body arched against his car, both of them completely lost in passionate embrace that left no room for innocent interpretation. The timestamp in the corner showed it was from 3 days ago, while Carol had been volunteering at the church food pantry, organizing donations for local families in need. Someone's wine glass hit the hardwood floor with a crash that seemed to echo forever in the stunned quiet, red wine spreading across the polished boards like blood. "These are from last Tuesday afternoon," I said calmly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system like liquid fire. Richard's face went through a spectacular series of color changes. Deep red to chalk white to an alarming shade of purple that suggested his blood pressure had just reached dangerous levels. He took a stumbling step toward the front of the room, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound, like a fish gasping for air. "Turn that off," he finally managed to croak, his voice barely recognizable. "Turn it off right now." I'd anticipated this exact reaction. I'd disabled all the keyboard shortcuts and positioned the laptop on a high table, where he couldn't reach it without climbing over furniture and making an even bigger scene. The remote control was firmly in my hand, and I had no intention of stopping now. I clicked to the next slide. This image showed Richard and Linda entering motel room 237 together, his hand resting possessively on her lower back, in an unmistakably intimate gesture that spoke of long familiarity and comfort with each other's bodies. Linda was looking back at him over her shoulder with an expression of pure sexual anticipation that made several people in the room gasp audibly. "And this is from Thursday afternoon," I continued in the same conversational tone, as if I was narrating a perfectly normal family vacation slideshow. While Carol was visiting her mother in the nursing home, Carol made a sound like she'd been physically struck by something heavy and sharp. She gripped the back of Uncle Tom's leather recliner so hard, her knuckles went completely white, her face draining of all color as she stared at the massive screen displaying her husband's betrayal in excruciating detail. "Stop this immediately," Richard roared, finding his voice and his rage simultaneously. "This is a massive violation of privacy. You're illegally surveilling people and trespassing on private property. Like you illegally interfered with my business relationships?" I asked sweetly, my voice dripping with false innocence. "Like you've been trespassing on my grandmother's final wishes and trying to steal what she left me?" The next slide was a screenshot of their text conversation from 2 weeks ago, blown up large enough for everyone in the room to read clearly without straining their eyes. "Richard, Carol's sister is visiting this weekend. Perfect cover for our cabin trip. Tell your husband you're at that spa retreat you mentioned. Linda, already booked the room under fake names. Can't wait to have you all to myself for 3 whole days. Richard, soon we won't have to sneak around anymore. Once I get this inheritance mess sorted out and liquidate the assets, we can start our real life together." The silence in the room was so complete I could hear the old house settling, the distant sound of waves lapping against the dock, someone's stomach growling from nervous tension. My cousin Jennifer, eternally the family peacemaker and conflict avoider, stepped forward hesitantly, her hands raised in a gesture of nervous conciliation. "Maybe we should take a break and discuss this privately." "No," Carol said suddenly, her voice stronger and more decisive than I'd ever heard it in 30 years of family gatherings. She released her death grip on the chair and stood up straighter, her spine rigid with newfound resolve, her eyes never leaving the screen that was destroying her marriage in real time. "Keep going. I want to see everything." So I did exactly what she asked. The next slide showed a hotel receipt from the Grandview Resort, a luxury property 2 hours away that charged more per night than most people made in a week. Richard had told Carol he was attending a mandatory real estate conference that weekend, claiming it was boring but necessary for maintaining his professional credentials. But the receipt told a very different story. He'd paid for the honeymoon suite and charged champagne, strawberries, rose petals, and couples massage services to the room. The dates corresponded exactly with their wedding anniversary weekend, which Carol had spent alone because her devoted husband was supposedly fulfilling professional obligations. "This is from your anniversary weekend last month," I told Carol gently, my voice softening with genuine sympathy for what she was experiencing. "While you thought he was working to provide for your future together." Angry murmurs started around the room as people began to find their voices again, the initial shock wearing off and being replaced by outrage on Carol's behalf. Shocked whispers, furious mutters, the sound of someone crying, probably one of Carol's sisters who was beginning to understand the scope of the deception. But I wasn't finished, not even close. The next slide was another text conversation, this one even more personally devastating than the previous ones. Richard, can't believe I have to sit through another endless family dinner pretending to care about Carol's incredibly boring stories. The woman hasn't had an interesting thought in 20 years. Linda, poor baby. At least you know it's temporary now. Once we get to Florida, you'll never have to pretend to be interested in her pathetic little life again. Richard, God, I can't wait. I'm so tired of this whole exhausting charade. The fake smiles, the fake interest in her day, the fake enthusiasm for her hobbies, the fake orgasms when I have to sleep with her. I stopped reading there, but the damage was already catastrophic. Carol's sister Susan had moved to her side, wrapping protective arms around her while tears began to flow freely down Carol's cheeks. Her entire world crumbling in front of 60 people who'd believed in the fairy tale of her perfect marriage. The room erupted into chaos. You absolute bastard, Uncle Tom shouted, stepping toward Richard with his fists clenched and his face flushed with rage. How could you do this to her? How could you betray someone who's devoted her entire life to supporting you? Get him out of here before I do something I'll regret, someone else yelled from the back of the room. Richard looked around desperately, his carefully constructed public image disintegrating in real time as he realized that 30 years of reputation building had just been destroyed in 30 minutes. She's lying, he said, pointing at me with hands that were visibly shaking. She doctored those photos using computer software. This is elaborate revenge because she knows she's losing the court case and getting desperate. Really? I pulled out my phone with theatrical slowness. Because I also have video evidence that's going to be much harder to fake. The video was the most devastating piece of evidence yet. Crystal clear footage shot from my car across the street, showing Richard and Linda in the motel parking lot with perfect audio quality. You could hear every word as Richard told Linda he loved her more than he'd ever loved anyone in his entire life, that Carol was just a boring obligation he had to endure until he could access enough money to be free. I've been miserable for years. His voice carried clearly through Uncle Tom's expensive sound system. Carol represents everything that's wrong with my life. The compromises, the settling, the pretending to be satisfied with mediocrity. But soon we can stop hiding. Soon I can stop pretending to be someone I'm not and finally live authentically. What about the inheritance situation? Linda's voice asked. That's almost resolved. The lawyers think we can prove the old woman was incompetent when she wrote the will. Once we get that money liquidated, we'll have everything we need for the Florida house and the new business. Carol can keep the local reputation and the community standing. We'll have the real assets and the freedom to build something genuine together. That's when Richard completely and utterly lost control of himself. His carefully maintained facade of respectability and moral authority shattered completely, replaced by the ugly, narcissistic rage I'd always suspected lurked beneath his polished exterior but had never seen fully unleashed. He lunged toward me like a wild animal, screaming about invasion of privacy and illegal surveillance, his face twisted with fury and humiliation. You pathetic, vindictive little bitch, he snarled, spittle flying from his mouth. You think you've won something here? I'll destroy you in court. I'll take everything from you and leave you with nothing. My cousin Mark, 6'4" and built like the linebacker he'd been in college, tackled Richard before he could reach me. They went down hard on Uncle Tom's expensive Persian rug, Mark pinning Richard to the floor while he thrashed and screamed threats like a demented person. Get him out of here immediately, Uncle Tom commanded, his voice shaking with a rage I'd never heard from him before. I don't want him on my property for another second. As Mark and two other cousins dragged Richard toward the door, he turned back to scream at me one final time, his face purple with rage and humiliation. You think this changes anything about who you really are? You're still nothing. You'll always be nothing. A broken little girl who never got over her parents' death and has spent her entire life making everyone else pay for her trauma. Actually, I said calmly, pulling out the manila folder I'd been saving for this exact moment, there's one more thing everyone should know about Richard's character and business practices. I'd saved the absolute best for last. The folder contained comprehensive copies of Richard's business financial records that Linda had accidentally forwarded to my email address 8 months ago. She'd been trying to send quarterly reports to his personal account, but had mixed up our email addresses in her contacts, an honest mistake that revealed Richard's dishonest business practices in devastating detail. Turns out Richard's been stealing from more than just family, I announced, spreading bank statements, property documents, and client contracts across Uncle Tom's coffee table like playing cards. He's been running an elaborate real estate Ponzi scheme for the past 4 years. The room, which had been buzzing with anger and shock, fell silent again as people processed this new bombshell that somehow managed to be even worse than the affair. Uncle Tom, a retired accountant who'd helped several family members with their finances over the years, picked up the documents with hands that were visibly shaking. His professional background meant he knew exactly what he was looking at, and his face went pale as he scanned the numbers. Client deposits, he said quietly, his voice heavy with disbelief. Money that should be in protected escrow accounts. Jesus Christ, Richard. You've been stealing millions of dollars from families trying to buy homes. The documents told a devastating story of systematic fraud spanning years. Richard had been using new client deposits to pay off previous obligations, classic Ponzi scheme behavior that inevitably collapsed when new money stopped coming in. When buyers put down earnest money for properties, instead of holding those funds in trust as required by law, he'd been diverting them to cover his business expenses, his affair, and his increasingly lavish lifestyle. He's been taking life savings from young families buying their first homes, I explained to the horrified room, using their children's college funds to pay for motel rooms and jewelry for his mistress. Carol was sobbing now, her entire world imploding in front of 60 people who'd believed in the fairy tale of her perfect marriage and her husband's impeccable character. Not only had Richard been cheating on her for years, but he'd been financing that betrayal with money stolen from innocent families. How many people in this room gave him money to invest? I asked quietly. 6 hands went up slowly, reluctantly. 6 families who'd trusted Richard with their life savings, their retirement funds, their children's college money, their dreams of financial security. Oh my God, Aunt Susan whispered, her face going white. Our entire down payment for the retirement condo in Arizona. The money for Jenny's wedding next spring, my cousin Mike said, his voice hollow with realization. $40,000. Mom's nursing home fund, someone else added. Everything we saved to make sure she gets good care. Uncle Tom was still examining the documents, his accounting background helping him understand the full scope of Richard's crimes. This goes back at least 4 years, he said, his voice getting stronger with anger. He's stolen from dozens of families, maybe hundreds. This is organized, systematic fraud on a massive scale. The evidence showed that Richard had been stealing an average of $200,000 per month for years, using increasingly sophisticated methods to hide the money trail and delay discovery. He'd created fake escrow accounts, forged bank statements, and even bribed a bank employee to help him cover his tracks. That's when Richard, still being restrained by my cousins, tried to make a run for it. He suddenly broke free from Mark's grip and bolted toward the back door, apparently planning to escape through the woods behind Uncle Tom's property. But the lake house was isolated, surrounded by dense forest with no roads for miles, and there was literally nowhere to go. The cousins tackled him again in the driveway, this time making absolutely sure he stayed down while Uncle Tom called the police and the FBI. You don't understand, Richard kept saying as they held him face down on the gravel, his voice muffled and desperate. I was going to pay it back. The business was just going through a temporary rough patch. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Everything would have been fine if she hadn't interfered, but the evidence told a completely different story. This wasn't a desperate businessman making one bad decision during a financial crisis. This was systematic, premeditated theft spanning years, carefully planned and deliberately concealed. The police arrived 45 minutes later, followed closely by 2 FBI agents who'd apparently been investigating suspicious real estate transactions in our county for over a year. Richard had been on their radar for months, but they hadn't been able to gather enough evidence to build a solid case. I handed over everything, the photos documenting the affair, the text messages proving their plans to use my inheritance money, the financial documents showing years of systematic fraud, the video evidence of their relationship. The agents spent 2 hours interviewing family members who'd invested with Richard, documenting the scope of his crimes and the number of victims involved. Richard was arrested on multiple federal charges including wire fraud, money laundering, and running a Ponzi scheme. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked back at our assembled family one final time. The expression on his face wasn't remorse, shame, or regret. It was pure, undiluted hatred, directed entirely at me. This is all her fault, he told the officers, his voice filled with venom. She's been planning this for months, maybe years. She's obsessed with destroying me because she's jealous of my success. The FBI agent looked at me with something approaching professional respect. Ma'am, you've helped us crack a case we've been working on for over 18 months. Mr. Harrison has been extremely careful about covering his tracks and hiding his activities. Linda was picked up at her apartment 3 hours later. She tried to claim complete ignorance about the business fraud, insisting she'd only been Richard's secretary and had no knowledge of his financial crimes. But the text messages proved she'd been actively helping him move money, hide assets, and deceive clients about the status of their investments. The aftermath was swift, brutal, but ultimately satisfying in ways I hadn't anticipated. Richard's real estate license was permanently revoked within a week. His company went bankrupt immediately, unable to pay back the millions he'd stolen or cover basic operating expenses. The FBI investigation uncovered even more fraud. He'd been stealing from clients for nearly a decade, using increasingly complex schemes to hide his crimes and delay discovery. The local newspaper ran the story on the front page for 3 consecutive days. Prominent businessman arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. The articles included detailed information about his affair, his attempt to steal my inheritance, and the family reunion confrontation that had exposed everything. The story was picked up by regional news outlets and eventually made it to national financial crime databases. Richard was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to avoid an even longer sentence. Linda got 9 years for conspiracy, money laundering, and helping to defraud clients. Both of them lost absolutely everything: their freedom, their reputations, their futures, and any possibility of the life they'd been planning together. Carol filed for divorce immediately, using the evidence from the reunion to prove adultery, financial misconduct, and emotional abuse. She hired the most aggressive divorce attorney in the state and systematically dismantled every asset Richard had tried to hide. She got half of what little he had left after restitution payments, plus the legal right to sue him for additional emotional damages. I can't thank you enough, she told me at the final divorce hearing 9 months later. I know you didn't do this for me specifically, but you saved my life. I could have wasted another 20 years with that monster, never knowing who he really was. She was absolutely right. I hadn't done it for her. though I was genuinely happy she'd been freed from such a toxic relationship. I'd done it for myself, for my grandmother's memory, and for every person Richard had hurt or planned to hurt with his selfishness and greed. The inheritance case was dropped immediately and permanently. Richard's lawyer withdrew when his client could no longer pay legal fees, and the judge dismissed all claims against my grandmother's will. I moved into Grandma's house 3 months later, finally able to afford the property taxes and maintenance costs, with money I'd earned from licensing my story to a documentary filmmaker and a true crime podcast. But the best part of this entire experience? I kept one photograph from that night at the lake house. It's a picture I took right after the final video finished playing. Richard's face in the moment he realized his carefully constructed life was crumbling around him in real time. The expression of a man who'd built his entire identity on lies and manipulation, watching 30 years of deception collapse in 30 minutes. That photo is framed on my desk now, right next to my favorite picture of Grandma working in her garden. Every time I look at it, I remember that sometimes the truth is the most powerful weapon you can wield, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, can be absolutely devastating when it finally arrives. Carol started completely over at 59 years old. She moved to Sedona, Arizona, opened a pottery studio specializing in therapeutic art, and sends me Christmas cards with pictures of her beautiful, peaceful artwork. In every photo she includes, she looks genuinely happy for the first time in decades. I never knew I could feel this free, she wrote in her most recent letter. I forgot what it was like to wake up without fear, to speak without walking on eggshells, to simply exist without constantly worrying about someone else's mood or approval. Richard sent me exactly one letter from federal prison, a pathetic, rambling attempt at self-justification and emotional manipulation that arrived about 6 months into his sentence. He tried to paint himself as the real victim, claiming I'd destroyed his life out of jealousy, spite, and an unhealthy obsession with revenge. He insisted he genuinely loved both Carol and Linda, that he'd been planning to end the affair and recommit to his marriage before I ruined everything with my vindictive interference. The letter was 12 pages of handwritten nonsense, full of misspellings and circular logic that revealed just how delusional he'd become in prison. He actually seemed to believe his own lies about being a misunderstood victim rather than a predatory criminal who'd hurt countless people. I burned that letter without reading past the second page. Some people don't deserve forgiveness, second chances, or even basic acknowledgement of their existence. Richard was definitely one of them. The families he'd stolen from eventually recovered most of their money through federal insurance programs and asset recovery efforts, though it took years of legal battles and bureaucratic procedures. Several of them sent me thank you cards and small gifts, expressing gratitude for exposing Richard's crimes before he could steal even more. You saved our entire retirement, Uncle Dave wrote. If you hadn't caught him when you did, we would have lost everything we'd worked 40 years to build. Our daughter can still go to college because of what you did, another victim wrote. We'll never be able to thank you enough. Last month, I received an official letter from the FBI agent who'd handled Richard's case. He was writing to inform me that my evidence had helped them identify a pattern of real estate fraud in 6 other states, leading to a massive federal investigation that resulted in dozens of additional arrests and the recovery of over $50 million in stolen assets. Your courage in exposing the truth has protected countless families from financial devastation, the agent wrote. You should be extremely proud of what you accomplished, not just for yourself, but for the entire community. I am proud, though not for the reasons people might expect. I'm not proud because I destroyed Richard's life, or because I got revenge on someone who'd wronged me. I'm proud because I found the strength to stand up for myself and other people, because I refused to be intimidated into silence, and because I helped protect innocent families from a predator who would have continued stealing from them indefinitely. Today, I'm successfully working as a freelance graphic designer from Grandma's house, building the business Richard tried so hard to destroy. My client list is longer than it's ever been, partly because people admire what I did, and partly because the publicity from the case brought me more attention and opportunities than I'd ever imagined possible. I've completely renovated Grandma's kitchen exactly the way she always wanted, with granite countertops, modern appliances, and a large center island where we used to sit and talk about my future while she helped me with homework or listen to my teenage problems. Every time I cook in that beautiful space, I think about the night at the lake house and how one carefully planned presentation changed the trajectory of so many lives. I never once regretted exposing Richard's affair and his crimes. The only thing I regret is not doing it sooner, not trusting my instincts about his character, and not protecting other people from him earlier in the process. Grandma would have been incredibly proud of what I accomplished. She always told me I was stronger than I realized, braver than I believed, and more capable than anyone gave me credit for. She was right about everything as usual. Justice, it turns out, really is the sweetest revenge of all.